Hi, welcome back everyone to Capitalism and Culture, a new phase in global interaction since 1945. And our focus today is religion and global modernity. Okay, modernity has presented a challenge to the world's religions. Advanced thinkers of the 18th and 20th centuries believed that supernatural religion was headed for extinction, and sharp decline in religious belief and practice occurred in some places. And the spread of scientific culture convinced small minorities that the only realities worth considering were those that could be measured scientifically. But the most prominent trends of the last century have been the further spread of the world's major religions, their resurgence in new forms, and their attacks on elements of a secular and global modernity. For example, Buddhist ideas and practices were well received in the West. Christianity has spread even further. The majority of Christians are no longer in Europe and the United States, and Islam also spread widely. And religious pluralism is on a level never before seen. So let's talk about fundamentalism on a global scale. Fundamentalism is a major reaction against modernization and globalization. Militant, piety, defensive, and exclusive. These terms characterize the nature of religious fundamentalism as a reaction to modernity. And many features of the modern world appear threatening to established religion. So they see science, states, and capitalism as threats. And so fundamentalists take these threats to their values and identity very seriously from these various forces of the modern globalized world. And it's also upset the customary class, family, and gender relationships. Nation-states often associated with a particular religion were undermined by the global economy and foreign culture, and it's led to a disruption that was often caused by foreigners from the West. And fundamentalists have responded with a selective rejection of modernity. They actively use modern communication technology, for example. So there are certain parts of modernity that fundamentalism wants to utilize. Now, the term fundamentalism comes from U.S. religious conservatives in the early 20th century who called for a return to the fundamentals of Christianity. And many saw the United States on the edge of a moral abyss. And so by the 1970s, they began to enter this political arena as the religious right. So it's American conservatives or conservative Christians that begin this path. In the United States, there was a powerful reaction against the secular liberationist movements of the 1960s. And so they adopted a political agenda and have been a major force in American politics since at least the 1980s. Another fundamentalism called Hindutva Hindu nationalism, that's developed in India in the 1980s, and they formed a political party, Bharatiya Janata Party. They opposed state efforts to cater to Muslims, Sikhs, and the lower castes, and the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, promoted a distinct Hindu identity in education, culture, and religion. And so in India, this party reacted to perceived secularization and to a perceived Islamic threat, becoming a major political force in India in the 1980s and the 1990s. So let's talk about creating Islamic societies and resistance and renewal in the world of Islam. Islamic fundamentalism is the most prominent fundamentalism of the late 20th century. Earlier, renewal movements focused on the internal problems of Muslim societies. And in the 20th century, they responded to external pressures as well. So with the post-colonial creation of new nation states, many pious Muslims did not like their secular policies. And so we see an Islamic opposition to these newly independent secular states. Great disappointments in the Muslim world occurred in the 1970s, and these new nation states that I'm referring to, Egypt, Iran, Algeria, they pursued basically Western and secular policies. And those new policies were largely unsuccessful. But however, the foreign intrusion continued. And there's a growing attraction of an Islamic alternative to those Western models. And the foundations laid early in the century, Maulana Maududi and Sayyid Qutb, and as well as the effort to return to true Islam that was labeled jihad. So the failed economic policies and increasing social tensions made the situation worse in many states. And so even, for example, in Israel, it was viewed as an outpost to the invading West and occupied sacred land. The Jewish state became a subject of mobilization. I think this is a great visual here that shows you the different percentages of the population and their religion. Like, for example, here in Africa, more than 90% here, north of the Sahara and even into Southwest Asia, more than 90% are Muslim. But the further south you go, that changes, right? So, and remember, we learned, I believe it was back in chapter 9, about the spread of Islam, right? Beginning here and spreading. And many geographical features are the reasons why Islam did not continue to spread. But because of the Indian Ocean trade, it also spread these directions as well. Okay, creating Islamic states, or societies, and the resistance and renewal in the world of Islam. Okay, let's continue with Egypt. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928, the earliest mass movement to resist Western influence. They gained a large following, still a major presence in Egypt. Is founded by an impoverished school teacher, and this mass-based party worked to include Muslim values of charity in government policies. This also led to penetration of fundamentalist thought in the Islamic world by the 1970s. There was an increase in religious observance. Many women voluntarily adopted modest dress and veils, and many governments use Islamic rhetoric and practice as an anchor. There's a series of Islamic organizations that were formed to provide social services. Islamic activists became leaders in unions and professional organizations, and thus leading to the entry into politics. So in a variety of states, often secular and authoritarian, rebel movements grew out of that, that used Islam as opposed to a political ideology as their source of mobilization. And some groups wanted to overthrow their compromised regimes, and that's what they sought. The Islamic movements took power in Iran in 1979, Afghanistan in 1996, some parts of northern Nigeria by 2000, implementing this radical Islamization. In Pakistan and the Sudan, military governments introduced elements of Sharia law, and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad assassinated Anwar Sadat in 1981. And that also led to attacks on hostile foreign powers. For example, Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon that targeted Israel. The response to Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Remember that 10-year war against the atheist Marxists politicized and radicalized Muslims around the world. In 1998, Al-Qaeda issued a fatwa, or religious edict, declaring war against America. And a lot of that was Osama bin Laden, an Arab volunteer in Afghanistan. He was further radicalized by U.S. troops deployed in Saudi Arabia during the first conflict with Iraq, and he would later launch an assault on American secularism, imperialism, and globalization. And there were also attacks on Western interests in East Africa, Indonesia, Great Britain, Spain, Saudi Arabia, and even Yemen. And the great enemy was, this irreligious Western-style modernity, as well as U.S. imperialism and economic globalization. This led to a violent struggle in the Islamic world. Fundamentalists interpreted the Quran in a highly literal and dogmatic ways, and were legalistic in regulation of their daily lives. They were opposed to innovation in religious practice, and defined those who disagreed with them as non-Muslims. And so many were drawn to a violent jihad as a legitimate part of Islamic life. And they were also deeply skeptical of Sufism, and known as Salafism. This form of fundamental Islam spread with financial backing of Saudi Arabia. And I thought this picture would be an important one to include here. Notice what's strapped to them. Many are wearing the headpiece. Right? And I think that the expressions of many of the ones in the background are also important. Some look determined, some look sad or upset, and some look dedicated. Now, let's talk about religious alternatives to fundamentalism. Now, militancy isn't the only religious response to modernity. There's been considerable debate within the Islamic world on this. Many have acted peacefully within established political structures, and some Muslim intellectuals have called for dialogue between civilizations. And some others have argued that traditions can change in the face of modern realities. In Turkey, Fethullah Gulen inspired a reformist movement. The Amen message call for Islamic unity was issued 2004 to 2005. And so many countries have moderate Muslim parties that participate in electoral politics. This movement in Turkey, the Sufi movement, encouraged interfaith and dialogue about their social problems. And we see that some are taking a different approach. Other religious traditions responded to global modernity as well. For example, Christian groups were concerned with the ethical issues of economic globalization. Liberation theology, especially in Latin America, advocated Christian action in areas of social justice, poverty, and human rights. And there have also been growing movements of socially engaged Buddhism in Asia. The first week of February in 2011 was designated by the UN as World Interfaith Harmony Week. And so with this liberation theology and socially engaged Buddhism and Christian movements, they urged the pious to address issues of poverty and inequality. And that sums up our section 3, the religion and global modernity. I will see you guys again for our last section of the last chapter, experiencing the Anthropocene era, environment and environmentalism.